Hi, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Simple Living High Thinking. We are unpacking Tukram Prabhu's weekly Bhagavad Gita class from every Friday night, and we are in the early texts of chapter 5. The text we're going over today was interesting. Tukram Prabhu pointed out that it's really a text that maybe doesn't need a ton of context. You can look at the verse on its own. Regardless, is there anything you guys would like to add for context for these verses?
I must confess that I came to class with a contextual framework in my mind. And therefore, this verse took me to a slightly different understanding that Tukaram actually walked us in class. The contextual aspect of this verse, based on what we've been studying, it's been a theme, right, from ever since chapter 2 started, where we are engaged in actions in the world without expecting their results and not being attached to the results. And in that way, our actions do not bind us to the material world. In other words, acting in that way is as if we were not acting, in the sense that we don't get any karma back, any karmic reactions back. So I had that context coming to this text. And when I hear here, and perhaps I should read the text so we know what we're discussing. So this is text 5 and, chapter 5, text 8 and 9. So it reads, a person in divine consciousness, although engaged in seeing, hearing, touching, smelling, eating, moving about, sleeping and breathing, always knows within himself that he actually does nothing at all. Because while speaking, evacuating, receiving, opening or closing his eyes, he always knows that only the material senses are engaged with their objects and that he is aloof from them. So when I read this text in preparation for class and being mindful of the context of previous chapters, I really thought that we're going to be discussing that if you are in divine consciousness, although you are acting in the world, it's as if you are not acting at all, because all your actions are guided towards pleasing Krishna. And in that way, you don't receive any reaction. And in that sense, we do nothing at all. So that's what I brought to class. But then as we went through, Tukaram took us to the actual understanding of the text, which is something quite different. So, and I believe that obviously that's what we're going to spend today talking about. So that was my contextual experience coming to the class. How about you, Varangi?
That was really helpful. I think that obviously his perspective on these texts is super important, but it's always good to maintain also his focus, which is that the Bhagavad Gita is a book with a beginning and an end, and therefore it should be studied in a structured manner, right, from A through Z, and not just pick whatever text and go from that and think that that's just a divine revelation, although there is some value to that, because obviously we accept this text as truthful because of many reasons, sound and logical reasons. It is nice to combine both. So sometimes the class takes a mood of, okay, this, like we did last night, okay, this text can be read out of context and doesn't need all this background information, which is what he did. But also, like you said, it's also very valuable to keep in mind where Krishna's at in the conversation, what's going on, what he has explained, what he has gone over, and where we're headed. And in this way, we get to, I think, in a chaste way, not have to be so focused on the context and then explore other meanings that are there. And at the same time, you're still grounded in the context, so you don't get too carried away and start giving the verses your own interpretation that may not be the case. And so I think it's a nice and valuable exercise to combine both, because that is Tukram's to Grand Prabhu's focus, you know, to always stay chaste to the verse. So having said that, I appreciated your introduction, your contextual introduction, because I was also thinking of it in that way. And it was, okay, we have just read about in text 7 how Krishna is explaining who that person is, that person that is engaged in acts, right, of devotion or connection in the world. And through a systematic approach and through a I guess a practice, right? He has purified the control of his mind and senses, and it's not just out of nowhere, right? And so everybody, he has been able to get to this platform where everybody's dear to him and he's dear to everybody because of the way he engages in the world. And such a person is never entangled because everything is done with consciousness. And so after that text, when we read this one, which you just read, I just thought, oh yeah, Krishna is expanding, giving us a little more information, more details about what this person looks like, how he acts, what that body that he is in, or he or she, right? It's the soul, the body that the soul is in, how that body comes into play in the most practical of ways, not even thinking, oh, what's our job, right? Or how we're interacting with our family members, but really just getting to the basics of how this body interacts with the material world, because the bodies matter. And so I thought that was just an extension of what the last verse was. And it was just, okay, it's continuing, Krishna's continuing to tie in more details and fleshing out new, not new, but the topics that he has introduced. So I also, like you, Soza Prabhu, was thinking of it in a more contextual way. And I really like the way that Tukram spin the class. And his introduction was really awesome. I was just totally captivated by all the things that apparently were tangents, but weren't. And how once he read the text, I was able to test my mind to see if I had remembered the introduction and how that tied into the text, because he always thinks that way, right? Like, let's see how I can trick them. And if we're not on all firing, you know, all cylinders, it's really easy to fall into what we're normally accustomed to doing, which is just to hear the last thing somebody says, but not really grasp the whole presentation. So that was really exciting for me. And yeah, I'm looking forward to diving in after we hear from Kim. What do you think? What was your reaction to the class and the verse?
Yeah, his take on the verses went completely over my head. I didn't even consider that aspect. I was just reading, taking them more at face value, like the whole, okay, actions, kind of like what you guys were saying, karma, as it relates to karma and reaction. And what I also liked his intro very much. And one thing about his intro that stood out to me was about feelings and emotions and how they can be like food. And like food, you can have a very unhealthy relationship with them. You can have an eating disorder with them. You can indulge too much with them. But his take was that emotions are healthy and they can get you on the right track. And if you take them too far, yeah, they can be not helpful, dysfunctional, but you shouldn't shy away from them, which is kind of what I grew up with. Like, just kind of put your head in the sand, don't get too angry, don't get too happy, just kind of stay level and don't talk about things. And so I don't think that's a very healthy approach. So I liked how he set the stage with getting into your feelings and in a healthy way.
I appreciate that point too. I that he was just like normalizing the fact that we are in human bodies. It's like, hey, this is what we got to work with, you know? And so I also appreciated that, because especially around spiritual circles, it's very rare to hear like of a healthy way in which we can combine our, you know, material existence with our spiritual process. And I thought that was really nice. I also enjoyed that part of the introduction. It was refreshing.
So then perhaps we should talk about what was this pen that was introduced. in class. So I'm glad to hear that it wasn't just me that came with this pre-understanding of the text. So, and as it turns out, we can read this text the way Tukaram explained it to us, quite literal. So let's try to break down a little bit. I'm going to go bits and pieces of the text again. A person in divine consciousness, right? So this is the soul. The person here is the soul in divine consciousness. So this is like a pure soul. Although engaged in seeing, hearing, touching, smelling, eating, moving about, sleeping, and breathing. So these are all different senses, right? We have our sense of sight and our sense of hearing and touching, smelling, and eating, and so on. So this is our senses and how we are engaging in the world. They're not describing right or wrong. These are just objective actions, things that we do without judging whether this is right or not. When we're just saying we are seeing things, we're not saying what it is that we are seeing. We're just, the text is just stating the fact that a soul in a material body sees things. So although performing all these actions through these senses, that person in divine consciousness always knows within himself that he, the soul, the actual conscious living entity, that he or she, like Varangi would say, we're talking about the soul here, right? It could be a soul in a male body or a soul in a female body. That person in divine consciousness always knows within himself that he actually does nothing at all. So the way Tukaram took us in class is not that the soul is doing something, but because these actions that the soul is engaged in are meant for Krishna's pleasure, then that soul will get no material karmic reaction. Not that, but actually a literal reading that the soul within the body is actually not doing anything. And it is only the senses of the material body that are engaged with the sense objects. But the soul is truly aloof from these activities and these engagements and is not doing anything at all, which then introduces quite a few possible problems, some good realizations, and that's what we ended up unpacking in class. So far, you guys want to jump in and comment on anything?
Well, I think that, well, you read the first half of the verse.
Right.
And you brought up a very important point, which is the explanation that this text is just saying what is, right? And not really engaging in a conversation of ethics. It's not an ethical text per se, or verse. And actually is just stating a fact that the soul is different from the body. Again, this is not new. This is an expansion of what Krishna introduced in the second chapter, right? And which is Sankhya, knowing the difference between matter and spirit. And this point of you are different, you as a spirit soul are different from your body, and there is a gap between those two things, really expands, I think, the scope or the conversation to include everything that's alive. It's not just us humans, right? Animals and even bad people, right? That we tend to judge as being bad because of their actions. So really at this point, you're introducing, you or Krishna and in the class was introduced, this point that we will later flesh out, about how Krishna is just stating the soul, regardless of what that soul, what body that soul has taken in this life, and how they act and interact with this world, those souls are still not acting. They're different, they're separated from their bodies. And although they are utilizing their bodies to engage in this world in different ways, either good or bad, or helpful or not helpful for spiritual life, etc., they are still in that group of pure spiritual beings. Therefore, they are never contaminated, they are never entangled, they could never be slain, they could never be broken, they could never be condemned forever. And so I thought that was the first point that was so important that at least for me, it just kind of, I didn't see it when we first read the verse, and you brought it up. So I wanted to highlight what that actually means and entails. That if we're talking about the soul, that actually means everybody that's alive and that has taken a body, plants, animals, people of all kinds of lifestyles and everything in between. And so I guess with that understanding, we can move on, unless Kim has something to add.
No, I think that's very complete. Thank you. Yeah.
So before moving on to the second half of the verse, I'd like to bring up an example of what we were saying, an analogy actually. Let's consider a fully autonomous Tesla. And you and we, the so-called drivers of that fully autonomous Tesla. So we are sitting there in the driver's seat, but because it is a fully autonomous car, you can just sit there and do nothing, while the car itself is engaged in so many activities. There's so many cameras throughout the car that will guide you. Like, okay, I can make a turn here, I can take a turn there, I need to stop because there's a car coming up. And it is accelerating, it's braking, it's consuming electricity to perform its actions, and so on. It's spinning the wheels. And so all kinds of actions are going on. And the car is using all this equipment in order to bring in information from its outside environment, which is really what the senses are doing for us in material bodies. However, the driver in this case, well, not really a driver, right? The passenger is just sitting there and not doing anything. So this is an attempt to exemplify what it is that we're talking about. The soul here in this analogy would be that passenger just sitting there. But in relationship to the outside environment, the passenger is in the inside and is not doing anything. He's just kind of going for the ride, and the car is doing everything else. So this is an analogy to help us paint a picture exactly of what we're talking about here.
I'm sorry, can I interrupt you? This just reminded me that actually, if you guys have a Gita and you want to look at this, there is a picture of what Tadeo just so expertly explained in very contemporary and modern terminology with the Tesla. But here the Bhagavad Gita is showing the senses as the horses, the mind as the driver, right? The reins as the, I believe that's the mind actually. The reins are the mind, and then the driver is the intelligence, and then the soul is in the passenger seat. So it is still a part of the package, but it's not directly connected to materialism, unless obviously it is because it's in the body. But that's also something that the Gita, thought about, giving you an example. And so it's definitely there, and there's a nice picture, and it could help you further understand what you just so expertly explained. But I just thought about that because I always think it's such an awesome picture to refer back to when we're thinking about the soul and the intelligence and the mind and the senses and how it all relates and to the material body and the world. So I just wanted to bring that up. Go ahead.
Go ahead, Kim.
Oh, I like that picture because the illustration of it, the expression on the face of the soul has always been entertaining to be like, what are you doing?
Right?
That's right.
And it's so helpful to see everything divided, because we tend to think that we are everything. Like we are our mind, our thoughts, our feelings. And we even think those feelings are the absolute truth, even though we don't realize that our senses are also prone to making mistakes and not really seeing properly or hearing properly, or, a lot of assumption there. And so it's really helpful to see the soul separated from the mind, the intelligence, the senses, and then in the world, how we're also a separate entity, just connecting in different ways. I also like that picture a lot.
Yeah, thank you for bringing that up, Varangi, because this visual aids are very helpful, because when we are encountering a spiritual tradition for the first time, from the East, that is, there is this heavy focus at first that, look, we are truly not this body, we are spirit, soul, and those things are completely different, right? So these visuals really helps us understand what we're talking about here. So thank you for pointing it out. This visual is available in Gita itself.
Yeah.
So second part of the text, because while speaking, evacuating, receiving, or opening or closing his eyes, he always knows that only the material senses are engaged with their objects, and that he, the soul, is aloof from them. So there's also something else that it's, I think, worthwhile mentioning here, that the first part of the verse is talking about input senses, senses that we use in order to acquire knowledge from the world, meaning things that we see, the things that we hear. And now in the second part of this text, we're talking about senses that having gotten that knowledge, how do we act, how do we express that in the world? And obviously speaking, right? We're gonna talk about things that we see. In fact, a little tangent here to exemplify. As you guys know, I have a 3-year-old and a 6-year-old, and kids, they're very engaged in seeing and hearing. They have this phenomenal ability to observe the world around them and learning how to speak. I believe that's probably why their brain are wired this way, because they're taking in all this information and they have to start speaking and formulating their own thoughts. So their brains are very well wired to receive information at that young age. But what's very interesting, and the point that I'm trying to make here, is that whatever it is that you feed them for like 10 or 20 minutes at the most, and then you stop that, they're going to then act that out. So if they are watching like Krishna, little Krishna video, and then Krishna is lifting Govardhan Hill or something like that, and they watch that for about 20 minutes, like a YouTube clip, certainly right afterwards, like there's an imaginary hill, there's an imaginary everything, and one of them is Krishna, the other one is the Gopals, and one of them is lifting. So they are acting it out. The information that their senses brought in to their consciousness, now they turn around and use the other senses to actually act that out in the world. Right? So the second part, now we are saying, okay, you are this person in divine consciousness. In divine consciousness is receiving all this input, and then now the second part, we are outputting what we got, but it's still the two parts ends in the same way, right? The first part ends by saying he actually knows that he himself does nothing at all, but while receiving information. But in the second part, while outputting the information, that person understands that he is aloof from all these activities, right? So not engaged or aloof or not part of it at all. So yeah, the soul is sitting there, not doing anything. And I think I'll quickly speak about what I think is beautiful in this text, and then I think we can problematize it very nicely. Now, I think it's beautiful that such a person in divine consciousness, according to the context of the Gita, is still engaged, right? The person is still there. Obviously, we can read it by seeing that that person in divine consciousness is seeing things related to Krishna, is hearing things related to Krishna, is touching and smelling and eating food that offer to Krishna. And then later, they're going to go out and speak in the world about this divine consciousness that they have. So I thought that there was a beautiful aspect of the text. However, the problem is highlighted here, where, okay, if the soul does nothing, then I can be engaged in rape, eating animals and doing things that are objectively wrong with the excuse that, well, but you know, I'm so transcendental to my material existence. I know that I'm not doing anything. And the only thing that is actually happening over here are my senses engaged with these objects. And then now I'm justified. So that becomes a problem if all that we understand from this text is this point. Like one may think that way, and that would be an obvious problem, right? So how do we troubleshoot that?
I love this problem because, as we saw during class, some of us didn't see it, and some of us did.
Before you continue, also another point is, right, so I can do something bad and say, well, it's not me, I'm the soul, I'm pure, it's just my senses engaging in these pitiful activities. Another problem, another point that someone may think, and I want to add this in here because I think you're going to flesh it all out, so you can perhaps speak to this too. Something else that somebody may consider trying to understand this verse is that, well, if I, the soul, am not doing anything, then why am I suffering, right? So who is actually ultimately responsible for the actions? Like, I'm not responsible, I'm the soul, I'm aloof from it all. The senses are engaged with their senses objects, but yet when the senses engaged in an improper way with their objects, I, the soul, I'm still receiving bad karmic reactions. So how do we troubleshoot that as well?
Well, I'm certainly not going to try to answer both questions or problems. I was actually looking forward to hearing you resolve this
That's
doubt.
an easy way out. You can do it.
But I did want to bring something up when you were speaking, and I hadn't thought about this until now, so I wanted to share that. And then I would love to hear the solution to this problem from you, Prabhu. So my connection that I had right now while you were speaking, when you gave the example of your children, and really your children are an example that really it's easy to relate to that. Even I'm not a child, but I can totally relate to that. And you know, if we watch a movie, it's, at least for me, it's like I think about it so much right after, or if it's something really impactful, I will think about this and kind of dream about it, or maybe think about it for a few days, and somehow or other it permeates everything else that I do for a little bit after that. And if it's something that's like life-changing, obviously, then you see a transformation. So it's not only for bad things, it also happens for really good stuff. And the three of us have experienced that because we're still around after a few years of coming across this deep knowledge, spiritual knowledge. So anyway, that thought really brought me back to the second chapter. And it's something that I know in our episodes we really went into depth, and specifically the section of this, the 60s. So 260, 260, 261, 262. Specifically, I'm going to read 262, which is Krishna explaining to Arjuna how the soul gets entangled in the material body and in this material world, which is while contemplating the objects of the senses, a person develops attachment for them. And from such attachment, lust develops, and from lust, anger arises. Then Krishna continues, from anger, complete delusion arises, and from delusion, bewilderment of memory. When memory is bewildered, intelligence is lost, and when intelligence is lost, one falls down again into the material pool. And so, again, it's just the whole chunk, and I know we went through so much detail about this part of the second chapter, so if you really want to learn a little bit more about this, please listen to that episode. So I'm not going to go too much into detail. But the reason why I thought about this was because it's really amazing how Krishna has been taking us through this journey of really explaining how this machinery works, the machine of the body, and really making it clear how we're not connected. We are, because we're in it and we're working it, but we're really not affected by it if we are in the right consciousness. And so this formula of knowing how it's so easy to slip into that consciousness of I am the body, I am materialistic, I am supposed to get something from this world to be happy and feel complete. Krishna is really letting us know, no, that's actually not the case. And if you do, this is what happens. So I was feeling really inspired by that early explanation of how the soul gets entangled, and how in this verse, in chapter 5, verse 7, Krishna is explaining how that body is still acting now in the most basic of ways, but it's not, because the soul has gone through some process of purification. Now the soul is not getting carried away by the actions, even though he's still acting. He's not getting carried away by the reactions of those actions that he must make in order to live, to actually stay alive. So that was one point that I wanted to connect, because again, and I'm sure I shared this last time, it's the first time that I'm going through the Gita where I feel really connected to everything that we've been through. It's not something that I just feel like, okay, I know what the fifth chapter is about, but then I've forgotten what the fourth and third and second chapter are about. This is the first time where I'm going through it, and I'm able to remember things that Krishna has already talked about. And then because we have talked about it in such detail, when new things come up, it's like, oh yeah, I remember that. So I just wanted to go through that and really encourage you guys to not be afraid to go back and make some ties and think about how what Krishna is saying is actually all related, but also introducing new topics. Now,
thank you, Varangi. I really appreciated you recalling those texts. That's a beautiful segue, and showing the interrelational aspect.
Thank you. It's weird. It's really nice because I hear Soza speak and then you speak something, and this exercise of talking about spiritual topics, it actually works. It's crazy. It's like this, you don't even think about it. I would never think, oh, I remember that text. But just from hearing you say something about the mind and the senses, and how even a child, after hearing something, goes and acts in the world, it's like, oh wait, I do that. Oh wait, Krishna talked about this. And how the easiest way that we can forget who we are as spiritual beings is by contemplating these objects that our body is inevitably going to connect to, right? And so it's so helpful to have these texts that are so practical, because they give such simple examples. Like in the same section, Krishna's talking about how the yogi is like a tortoise, and it retracts its limbs under the shell when he knows that some objects are around that are going to distract him from his mental meditation and from his spiritual process. It's like, that's so easy to remember. It's like, who doesn't see a turtle? I mean, even on TV all the time, I see turtles everywhere. And it's like, I always remember that from the Gita. It's like, oh yeah, I should be like the yogi. When danger is around, you just retract your senses. And the more you do it, the stronger you become. So by chapter 5, which is just chapter 5 out of 18 chapters, by chapter 5, this person that has been practicing that retraction of senses, that cultivation of spiritual knowledge, hanging out with people that are doing the same thing, not giving in to the contemplation of something that we shouldn't really be doing. All these things, by the 5th chapter, we see like such a huge upgrade of this person's life. And this isn't really, I don't think Krishna's talking about a completely self-realized person at this point. He's just talking about somebody that's connected, somebody that has made that progress to realize, okay, I'm still attached, but I'm in this world, so I'm at work, but I have a little bit of intelligence to connect the fruits of that labor to something higher. And of course, we see how Srila Prabhupada's translation is taking as foreshadowing, right? This person will eventually get to devotional service, which is the translation of bhakti. So bhakti hasn't been introduced at this point, but we can see how this person has really upgraded through the chapters. And so I found that really, I feel really grateful that Krishna is speaking in such, they're deep terms, but also in such practical ways that it's even for somebody like me, I'm able to remember what he said a few chapters ago. And I had never really had that experience where it was like, oh yeah, he just talked about this. So thank you for letting me tap into that and use that, because really I would say that's the first time where I felt like, oh yeah, it was in the second chapter. I need to find it. And the second chapter covered so much ground, but anyway, so I'm feeling inspired about that very tangible consequence of studying. Even if you study once a week, which is what I do, even that little bit of studying still yields so much fruit when it comes to remembering little jewels that will help you act better in this world. So I don't want to tangent further from the question and the problem that Sosa Prabhu posed, that definitely is so important to address. But I think, yeah, now I'm ready to hear the answer, because it's true. It's like this verse, it's really nice on one sense. And then in another sense, it's like, wait a minute. So you're saying if you're spiritual, or if you have this label of a religion, then you're free to do anything. And if so, there's something wrong. And also the second point is, well, does that make you a better person just because you say you're a part of something? And which is still a material covering, saying, oh, I'm Christian, I'm Hindu, I'm this, I'm that. That's still materialistic, right? Because in a sense, we're all spiritual. So does that, the fact that you label yourself as something, make you better than somebody else that doesn't have this knowledge, or somebody else that's in ignorance and it's acting according to that ignorance? So how do you resolve that? And I think those were the 2 points, right? That you made. Did I miss something?
The first being, can we justify bad actions by hiding behind the fact that I'm a pure soul, I'm not doing anything, it's just my senses, right? That's the problem you said you loved. So
That's right.
Just one more element to the solution today that you're going to provide.
oh wow, am I?
is, we've been talking about someone who is religious, be it Christian or Hare Krishna, whatever the case may be. But what about taking a person who isn't religious at all and their actions? Like, that's another problem is, so that person who's not religious at all, are they not doing any, do they not have any repercussions either?
Okay.
Yeah, so that was something that I had thought about, but I don't know if you brought that up earlier. I don't think you did. It was about just being, because we're spiritual, therefore I'm able to do whatever I want, because whatever, I'm not connected to my actions. What was the second point? It was not about labeling or material labels. What was the second point, Prabhu?
If I am a pure spiritual soul and therefore not really the one acting or engaged with actions in the world, why am I still suffering when I engage in bad actions, right? Why am I still receiving the karmic reactions if I wasn't the one who did it, if I'm completely aloof and did nothing at all?
Perfect. Okay, great problems. Let's hear the answers.
All right, so the first one, can I justify any bad actions based on the fact that I'm a pure spiritual soul? No, you cannot. When you engage in actions that are objectively bad, you are going to receive the karmic reactions of those actions, despite you being a pure spiritual soul. When we say a pure spiritual soul here, like, yes, it's non-contaminating. The soul never gets contaminated. The example that Tukaram brings up, which I like so much, is water. So at its deepest level, when we break down to molecules of water, we see that perspective. You can put dirt in the water. Let's say you have a cup with fresh drinking spring water. And then you look at that water and you say, yeah, that's clear, clean water. But then you put dirt into it. and then you mix it all up. Well, it turns colors, it becomes brown, and then you say, oh, that's dirty water. Well, it's not actually dirty at the molecular level. When you go to the molecules of water, it has never been contaminated itself. That's why it is possible to distill water through an evaporation process, etc., and then you get the pure water again. So that contamination was just temporary and never actually impacted the soul, the molecule of water. So in this case, the soul. So the soul is always pure, which differs from some other religious understanding where, I don't want to get into this too much, but since we're here, because of the actions of Adam and Eve, which took place thousands and thousands of years ago, I am the soul, but I am a sinner. I'm impure because of that original sin. The ontological study of the soul here points to something different. That no, the soul is always pure. It can be under the coverings of a impure mind, intelligence, and the senses, but the soul itself remains pure. Now, the engagement of the senses with their sense objects, still there is, Varangi, you mentioned a gap, and I like the word you said, you used the word gap. I like that, because there's the soul, and then there's a gap, and then there's the intelligence, the mind, the senses, and so on. So what is that gap? That is something that I certainly contemplated on for many years. Like, what is the ultimate link? If the soul is completely different from the senses and the senses object, like the soul is doing nothing at all, so how does it ever link? And to me, that gap is a mix of intelligence and free will, because the soul carries desires. If the soul is self-realized, it understands, I am Krishna's servant, and my desire is to serve and love Krishna. But when I am in a material body, I am now covered by a different intelligence, by a different mind, and by different senses. But I still have free will. And the soul, that little gap is what the soul will send to the intelligence. Okay, my desire now in this material existence is to satisfy my senses. And the intelligence will weigh it out. Okay, is this good or bad for me? And the intelligence will come up with a plan to achieve that particular desire. So if the soul is desiring to have a particular experience, now the intelligence, the mind, and the senses will engage. And those actions are aloof from the soul. But the soul, nevertheless, is still there in the passenger seat, carrying that desire to experience sense gratification. And when the body does act, then it is subject to a karmic reaction. And the soul will experience that. So I guess this is speaking to both problems, right? No, you cannot justify your bad actions just because you are pure soul. Bad actions are still bad actions, and they're still going to bring about karmic reactions. And why am I still suffering? Well, because the soul still has that desire to have its own self being glorified as opposed to glorifying Krishna. And that gap that you mentioned, Varangi, then transpires into the intelligence, which the material senses now will act in the world in order to have that experience. The soul sits in the passenger seat, only being aware of all the experiences that mind, intelligence, and senses are bringing about. And so now, that's why we still suffer. The soul there is a gap, but the soul is still ultimately linked with its own intelligence, material intelligence, and free will to act according to its desires. And the material intelligence and the material mind will still act. And even though the soul wasn't the doer of the action, it was the material senses with material objects. If it was a wrong action, the soul is still going to suffer the consequences of that bad action. we have an understanding through our scriptures and our teachers that mind, intelligence, false ego, and all the senses that we currently have in a material body, they're material. Nevertheless, we have those exact same things, intelligence, mind, and senses, in our pure spiritual form. But in the spiritual world, in that pure spiritual form, we are using mind, intelligence, and senses to place Krishna. But here in the material world, we are using our intelligence, mind, and senses to place ourselves. That's the ultimate, I would say, defect of material existence. So again, that little gap to me is important, right? It is how does it go from the soul to the senses? And it's that desire based on, you have free will to act out your desires. But Krishna therefore gives us a temporary material intelligence, a temporary material mind and senses through which we can carry out the desires of the soul. Engaged in a proper way, it will lead us to liberation, back to our spiritual existence. Engaged in a material way, meaning we ourselves want to then enjoy the results of those actions, we are going to be perpetually entangled in material existence. Varangi?
Excellent. Thank you. That was really clear. I would say, not argue. Well, no, I think you eventually got there. I was going to say that gap, it sounds like it's that lust that Krishna was talking about in the second chapter when Arjuna was asking him, well, what makes us do the wrong thing when we know what's right? Mm-hmm. It's like, what, and I think that's that really, I think, fits well. What do you think? That lust would be a good definition for that gap?
Yes, the actual Sanskrit word is thirst, right? Like right. Thirst, which is like what comes up in Buddhist philosophy as well, thirst. But that we translate into lust, because, and then lust also not being limited to sexual desires. Lust really pointing to any desire, any attraction to anything that is material.
Right. For your own gratification.
For your own gratification, as opposed to for Krishna's pleasure, right? So that lust, that thirst, that desire. So lust, thirst, and desire is being used synonymously here, interchangeably. Right. You can use either one of these three words and you would still bring about the same conclusion. So because the soul, and that's what I meant by the soul carries desire, the soul carries that thirst, the soul carries that lust to have itself be glorified, to have itself be the receiver of enjoyment and pleasure, right? But that is unnatural. So then Krishna, being magnanimous, even allow us to fulfill that foolish desire by creating the entire cosmic manifestation and giving us these material bodies, but with a temporary material mind, intelligence, and senses through which we can live out this lust.
Yeah, that was another point. I was like thinking, wow, it's so amazing that even though we have this desire, right? And we want to experience what it's like to be like God, because that's really what the bottom line is. It's like, well, how come Krishna gets all that? I want some of that, right? Mm-hmm. That Krishna really facilitates. It's like he facilitated a place where we could learn through very therapeutic experiences that we are not meant for this. It's like, we see, and Tukram brought this up, pigs, in other countries really basking in the sewers and thinking they're so happy eating stool. And as a human, we look at them, we're like, oh my gosh, they don't really know what they're eating. It's like, let me just like give them some vegetables or something, right? So in the same way, I think our teachers are thinking this way. Look at these souls. They are thinking that they can find happiness through family life, through cars and bank accounts and all these things. And they don't understand that the real wealth is your connection to divinity that
Right.
actually encompasses everything that we can find in the material world and so much more. So I was just thinking, wow, it's really so amazing how Krishna facilitates. And now your explanation of how free will comes into the picture was so helpful too, because it really keeps us from blaming God. It's like, okay, well, if you're all powerful, why couldn't you just make me love you, or make me turn towards you, or make me not have a body that would get me more addicted to this world, right? And we understand that through free will, Krishna is actually not all powerful. He has given up some of his power to allow us to make a choice, because that is the best option of all worlds where love exists. Love is based on a lover and a beloved, and it's fully voluntary. And so if God is all good, he would arrange for such a world to exist. He wouldn't arrange for all these automatons, like Tikram calls them, where there's really no love because he's making everybody love him. It's like, what is there to that? You know, we wouldn't even accept such an arrangement. You know, if somebody is with us because we tell them they have to and they have to love us back, it's like, oh, I don't want to be in a relationship like that.
Right.
So why would we expect God to be the same, right? So out of his actual love for us, he has given us free will, and he has allowed us to make some choices, and those choices are either helping us in our spiritual life or getting us further and further away. But eventually, you know, because we are spirit souls, we all get back to that eternal relationship. Some of us faster than others, but it's definitely a therapeutic experience. Now, something that was brought up in class was by two of our illustrious classmates and friends, was the fact that we don't know what is right or wrong doesn't protect us from getting or not getting the consequences. You know, it is our responsibility to become educated. And this was such an amazing point. I really love that, because I've heard about this a lot. And an example that comes up so much is, well, if you go to another country where they drive in the opposite side of the road and you're a tourist, you just got there, you just got a rented a car, and then you drive on the right side of the street, you get in a car accident, you're not going to be saved by saying, well, I didn't know I was supposed to drive on the opposite side of the street. It's like, it's granted, it's like it's like a unstated premise that you would first read about the country, get educated, even see if you're qualified to drive. Like when I go back to where I was born in Colombia, I would never drive there. I don't care if I'm like a NASCAR driver, I would never ever risk my life in trying to drive there. It's just too crazy. And I know how to drive, and I'm from there, and I grew up there, and I speak the language, and I can do a few of those and get people out of my way. But it's like, even that, it's like, I know I don't want to put myself in that situation. So what's to speak of if you're in this world, have had a few accidents? It's like, why wouldn't we sit and ask questions? Maybe I'm doing something wrong. Maybe there's something that's not matching. Why? What am I meant to do? How is this world designed? What's a part of this world? Who am I? How do I fit in? Where does God come into the picture? And if you don't believe in God, then even having that conversation of why not? Why don't you believe in God? What does it take for you to start believing? What would you take as proof? So many things, right? And so the fact that we don't know isn't an excuse. We're still going to get some reactions.
This is an excellent point, Varangi. And I was talking about this point with my wife yesterday, and I'd like to expand on that. I think it will be very beneficial. Another way in which this flaw in understanding transpires at large in our society today, I would say especially in the United States, is the idea behind, especially like parents saying, well, whatever makes my children happy, I want them to have that, whatever it is that makes them happy. Or just not necessarily parent-children relationship, but just like a well-wishing friend. Like, oh, whatever makes you happy, it's good. Like, I'm going to help you do whatever makes you happy. The fundamental flaw with this mindset, with this way of thinking, is the unstated premise that happiness is subjective, and that there aren't things that I should learn, that I should know, that I should study in order to realize what is actually going to make me happy. Thinking that happiness is subjective, I'm going to think, oh, whatever makes you happy. Well, what if what makes me happy is rape or eating animals? Like, is that then good? Am I going to help you doing that? No, it's not. Happiness is objective. As a pure soul, our ontological position, our constitution is to love and serve Krishna, and that makes us happy. And that's objective, and it's not going to change. That's what we need to do in order to be happy. If we're thinking, oh, whatever it is that's going to make you happy, that's what I'm going to help you achieve, it exposes the fundamental flaw of the unstated premise that happiness is subjective. When it's not, it's subjective. I think it points out to laziness, is what you're saying, Varangi. Why don't we study? Why don't we take the interest to learn the books, to ask what are the laws? What am I subject to in this material world? Like, and own it and study it and gain and conquer our own happiness, right? But it's so much easier to just say, oh, whatever makes you happy. Whatever makes you happy means you're not willing to put your mind into it, to figure out what is happiness, you know? So I think it's a very easy way out to not want to know, like, oh, I did the wrong thing, but I didn't know. It was my pursuit of happiness. No, your pursuit of happiness shouldn't be so shallow. You should know what you're doing.
Yeah, and this reminds me of an amazing example that Devamrita Swami gives very often, when he says, and this points to how when it's about other people, we're a little more lax, right? Oh, it's whatever makes them happy, okay. But when it's something about you, and he says, you know, would you let a friend say to you, like, let's say you needed to have heart surgery because your heart was failing, and your friend's like, I really love you so much. Like, I love you so much, I'm going to do the surgery myself. Would you let them operate on you? Of course not. Why? Because you require some qualifications. You want them to be surgeons. You want them to have a lot of years of experience. You want them to have some gurus, right? Teachers, hopefully a prestigious university where they learned how to do surgery on other people. So many things. So why is there that difference in standard, right? When it's something that's gonna maybe come in the way of you enjoying in this world, then you're like, oh, wait a minute, what's going on here? I require a little bit of a CV, like I need to make some interviews to see if you qualify, right? But when it's about other stuff, it's like, oh, it's just not that important. Whatever makes you happy, you should do. It's like, no, whatever that person is going to do in this world is going to directly affect me. Like, maybe not right in front of my eyes in that second, but this person that thinks that eating animals is okay and goes and invests money into like the meat industry, all that is affecting me as well. Why? Because they're killing the world ecologically, because they're killing more animals, and the bad karma is piling up because more fires are happening. Global warming, epidemics, exactly. Global hunger, so many things. From where does that all come from? From one person making a wrong choice, a bad choice, and you saying, oh, it's all right, you know? Like, it's not all right. Yeah, we should take it as if we ourselves were making those choices. And I think it is a responsibility that everybody needs to own. It's up to us to make a change. It's up to us to change this world, and it actually does happen that way, one person at a time. If you take the time to learn, to educate yourself on how to live in this world and not get entangled, right? Then you can pass on that knowledge to other people, directly or indirectly, and then those people are going to transform their lives, and then those people are going to, like that, so on and so forth, and the chain reaction is going to be massive. And so we've seen this with so many things happening around the world. Why do we think that spirituality is any different? Why do we think whatever you want to believe in, which is true, of course, we're a non-sectarian group, you know, it's like whatever you want to believe in, okay, great, but there is some universal ethics by which you should be guided. And it's not okay for you to kill people that don't believe in your same religion. That's like, should be known by everybody and should be kind of like a standard practice, and it's not. So there is obviously a problem. There is a gap, and not the gap we've been talking about, but the gap of integrity, which
Right.
Tukram went into during class. It's about time that we start acting in this world in the same way that we are feeling inside, and hopefully not in our low levels, hopefully more in like what, let's start acting the way we're preaching. Let's start walking the talk. Let's start being people of integrity, where if nobody's watching, what am I doing at home? If nobody's watching, what am I doing on my phone? If nobody's watching, how are you treating your relationships? Are you being, honest, straightforward, willing to make amends and own your mistakes when you make them? Because we're all going to make mistakes, And so when we think about this whole thing, it's like actually spirituality goes so hand in hand with our material life. And so I think this verse is and the whole conversation that has come from it, it really boils down to that integrity, who you are, who we are, what knowing this knowledge means, and what is okay to do and what's not okay to do. So what's okay to do? For you to realize that you're not this body and you're a spiritual being and you're meant for something bigger than that, and you have this body, so use it wisely. And what's not okay to do? To think that because you're spiritual that you can do whatever you want. Because you're spiritual and you have this knowledge, then that you should treat other people as less than, or think that even the rapists or the sociopaths or the kidnappers or the child traffickers are forever doomed. No, they're actually still spirit souls. That's a hard pill to swallow, right? To realize that because you are a spiritual being, so is everybody else. Therefore, you have to develop some compassion. You have to be able to connect with them in whatever way possible. So, because we're all affected by each other's actions and reactions in this world. And so, yeah, I'm really appreciating how deep this verse got us in terms of conversations and questions. And thank you for resolving these massive questions that could come up in some people's minds.
To the last point you made about compassion towards others through the eyes of this verse is something that I got from class, and I was contemplating afterwards. And it's just to expand on that a little bit, right? So if I realize that I'm a pure soul, like we were discussing earlier, and never contaminated by these seemingly wrong actions of the material world, then I can also recognize that in others. So then when other people offend me, I can focus on the fact that, look, these are their modes, the modes of material nature, through the senses, material senses and senses objects that person is currently using. That's what's actually going on. But I'm not gonna aim my hatred and my anger towards that soul. I still understand that within that body is a pure spiritual soul, divine soul that I should actually respect. So that helps me develop compassion. Not I'm better than you, I'm spiritual, I'm here.
Not self-righteousness.
Correct. And you're degraded. You're such a materialistic person. You're there. And because I'm so much better than you, I pity you because I see the good in you, but you're actually a bad person. Not that. An actual understanding. This is what's going on everywhere, which is what also leads us into not killing animals for eating them. We understand there's a pure soul in there, and I'm going to respect them as such. But in the form of a human being that commit offenses against me, I can maintain that in mind, and it will help me forgive and forget. It will help me develop my compassion through that understanding. Now, the nuance point that I want to also expand on this is that does not make us weak. That does not make us That doesn't put us in a position where we allow others to exploit us, where we allow others to take advantage of us, because we are now saying, oh, but that's a pure spirit soul. It is just their misguided senses offending me. And you just take offenses and you let people take advantage of you. That's not the point that is being made here. In fact, it's a huge theme of the Gita. We do our duties. Even if our duties, in the case of Arjuna, was to actually go and kill people, right? But Krishna even uses that same example. Actually, their souls, like you mentioned, Varangi, can never be cut into pieces, can never be burned by fire, can never be moistened by water. That's pure spiritual soul over there. But you still do your duty. In case of Arjuna, it was terrible, right? He had to go and like act violently. So I'm trying to merge these two seemingly extreme concepts. That number one, no actual person, the soul, can ever do anything wrong towards you because they are always pure spiritual soul. So that's like one extreme, because like nobody's doing you wrong. It's just their senses and their engagements with material nature that is doing you wrong. So you can develop your compassion. At the same time, you don't become weak and meek and allowing people to take advantage of you. You still stand up for what you believe is right, with the understanding that that's a pure soul and I must do my duty still. So you hold both things together, I think is a really, you can get to a really good place with that understanding.
Yeah, wonderful. Thank you. That was necessary. There's always, it's so amazing. I love this because there's always another side to it.
Right.
And it's, this is a place to bring all that up. And we encourage you guys, if you're listening and you have a question or a comment, please leave comments and questions. We're checking them and we can definitely address them in the episodes as we record it. Right?
That's a very good point, Varangi. And I think Kim can speak to that. She's doing an excellent job of managing our online presence. But yes, Kim, our audience would be able to post questions and comments and so on, right?
Oh, definitely. Yeah. And whatever platform that you prefer, whether it's Instagram or Facebook or whatnot. So YouTube.
I know we're running out of time, but I really don't like to leave stones unturned. Kim, you brought up another problem, another question, which were the labels, like religious labels, right? And I don't think we addressed that. If I understood your question correct, was that, do we see a pure spiritual soul as not being engaged in the actions in the material world, even if that person is, say, for example, Christian or Muslim or a Jew? Was that your question?
Yeah, or more so someone who's not religious at all, just completely ignorant or choosing to, atheistic, let's say.
Are they still pure souls? That's the question.
Yeah, do they not? A problem that could come up as well as this first saying that someone who's just ignorant of God, are they not having any karmic reactions either?
Well, they are having karmic reactions, right? Based on the free will they have and the intelligence that the material intelligence they also have that Krishna gave them. They are choosing to act in a particular way, and they're going to get karmic reactions no matter what. But nevertheless, whether you are a Christian, a Jew, a Muslim, a Buddhist, or Hindu, Vaishnavas like ourselves, nevertheless, these are all our material designations, and we are always pure, uncontaminated spiritual souls, never really interacting with matter. We are that spiritual soul. And then also, even animals, right? We are saying humans that are acting ignorantly. Well, animals have a lot of instinct. They have some kind of intelligence. Some animals, very minute, but they are still acting. And then we also recognize even there that that's actually a pure spiritual soul over there. Part of the reasons why we don't kill them and eat them. Did we really address your question? Was that what you were asking?
Yeah, I think if someone had that question, it was definitely addressed through multiple ways, like you just said. So, yeah, and go ahead.
So we definitely, I agree. We definitely covered.
Yeah. I just really enjoyed the conversation in last night's class or Friday night's class about integrity, and how this verse, when I first read the verse, sometimes in the Gita, I'll read verses that say, oh, for a pure soul, or the way this verse starts out, a person in the divine consciousness. And then I start to think, oh, well, this is referring to someone at Radhana Swami's level, or someone who's self-realized. And I kind of back away from the verse like it's something that will be attainable in many lives to come. And so, Vrangi, I really appreciated your point of saying that Krishna is not necessarily talking about a self-realized soul here. This verse really speaks to the integrity of the soul, like you're saying, the purity of the soul, and that anyone has the ability to awaken spiritual consciousness. It's kind of what our soul is geared towards and what we're desiring ultimately. And so I've always had a very huge curiosity about what it takes for someone who's in suffering, just cycles of suffering, and what it takes for them to make that jump to spirituality. Is it hitting rock bottom, or is it logic? And obviously there are multiple ways to come about it, but I think overall what I like to take from this is just the potential of spiritual awakening in everyone, understanding how the soul is made up and what it consists of.
Thank you. I do want to clarify something in case somebody else may not have heard what I said earlier, but I think that when you're reading these texts, because we're getting the translation from somebody that's obviously, Srila Prabhupada, he knows exactly what Krishna is going to bring up in the future, obviously because of the book itself. But it's not wrong to think, okay, our teachers are here, because actually, because they're here, that also covers any other ground that's a part of that level where they're at. And it's important to also take the verses as, okay, where am I in that gamut, or in that range? And so it's certainly helpful, in my opinion, and I know this is something that Tukram also brings up. It's a lot of these verses are prescriptive and descriptive. They're describing somebody that's already there, and also prescribing, like, how can you get there? And so it's helpful to not think of a certain verse, oh, this is talking about somebody that's here. It's like, well, hopefully if you're reading the Gita and you're studying it, you also want to be here. So this also pertains to you in some way, right? Yeah. And so specifically about the translation, yeah, it's somebody that's yukta, somebody that's connected, right? And because of context, we realize that this is somebody that still is not in the perfected stage, but is developing that divine consciousness, that exercises that divine consciousness. Like, I can certainly say that I have divine consciousness sometimes, not all the time, but I'm moving in that direction. And I certainly have more divine consciousness now than I did years ago. So we're moving, and the more we do this process, the more we go towards that goal. But it certainly, I think, applies to anybody on that range, wherever you find yourself, either as a beginner or as our teachers, which are the gold standard. And so it's helpful to remember that it's good to know the context and where we're at in the Gita, and what Krishna is meaning or referring to when he says he's describing those people. Also, it's very important to take Srila Prabhupada's translation of the words very seriously, and if we need to expand on it, to read the purport about it. And but also to remember that these verses are prescriptive and descriptive, and sometimes both. And if we are serious about our spiritual life, we should take these verses as an instruction. Why not? What are we going to lose from that? Nothing. You just gain. Oh, okay, I'm not here. Okay, but Krishna just explained how I can get here, so I'm just going to really study that process. Or, oh, I'm definitely there. Okay, great. I should really keep going and continue doing that, because remember, bhakti is not just a destination, it's also the way to get there. And so that's huge in our tradition. Devotional service, which is what this yukta person is going to eventually get to, is to be able to act in this world with a lot of love for God, mentally, physically, right? And so it's the same process, it's just explained in different ways and in different levels for everybody to feel like, oh, okay, I connect here, but this is where I want to go. I'm not here yet. Okay, but I can start here. Oh, and this is how I can get started. So the whole Gita is like a manual. And so I really appreciate you bringing that up, because it's certainly something that came up in my spiritual life. But also, even if people haven't thought about that, I think it's a good thing to be specific about the fact that anything in the Gita that's brought up, you can tap into it, either as a goal or as a way to get to that goal. Would you agree with that, Soza Prabhu?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, I can't even comment on it because you said it perfectly.
Our teacher's explanations that I think that they really address that doubt also that I had. So I appreciated Kim bringing that up. Not as a doubt, it was a comment, but I thought it was a good opportunity to take to explain that aspect of how the verses are could be read.
Yeah, and I appreciated your point about it being prescriptive at times in the Gita. And whenever I'm having challenges or feeling a little bit down about my progress or where I am, I just go back to the basics. You know, one of my favorite verses that stood out to me in the beginning was chapter 9:34, I think, where it's like, always think of me, worship me, be my disciple, and surely you'll come to me. And I just, like, when I'm having those tough days, I just think the basics like chanting, good association, and it'll happen. And I just have faith in the part of it will happen. You'll make the progress. And so,
I mean, it's so amazing that you would think that's so basic. I'm thinking, wow, what a wonderful person, you know, like to come across in the world with somebody that's thinking, oh, yeah, I just need to think of God and I just need to offer something with love and I need to become his student and I need to read. Like, wow, like I want to be your friend. Like, you think that's basic? Like, that's so, you know? And so it's really important to keep one of my Shiksha gurus, one of my teachers that have helped me, you know, transform my life. He said to me one day, it's really important to keep looking forward, like how far do I need to go, but don't forget to look back and see how far you have come. So it's very important for you to look in both directions. And that stayed with me for years. And I think that's a great point, and thank you for sharing. And the fact that you're remembering these verses and thinking like this, it's a gold standard for a lot of us, you know, and even some people that can't even get started on that. The basics would be just remembering that they're not their body. It's something I forget a lot of times, you know, and so that point of going back to the basics to regain some strength to keep going, it's, if you could only remember one thing out of this episode, please remember that. Always go back to the basics and just not giving up, right? Just like stay the course. Everything happens. It's like magic, but it's not magic because you're actually putting in a lot of work. But it happens all of a sudden. You're like, wow, like I'm saying this. Wow, I was just picking meat out of my teeth just a few years ago. And now I'm talking about how I can become self-realized. It's like amazing. It's like magical, you know?
yeah, it really is. All right, well, we're a little bit over time, but that's okay. Thank you, guys. What was that today?
Our tradition now.
It is, yeah. Yeah, soon we'll be at a 3 to 4 hour episode. It'll be okay.
Well, hopefully we're moving towards having live episodes. That would be awesome.
That's true.
Including more people, and so we'll see. Drop a message or a comment below if you would like us to.
Yeah, and we will post a link, as always, to Tukram Prabhu's Friday Gita class. And you can tune in live every week, Friday, 7:30 p.m. Pacific, on whatever platform you choose, Facebook, Instagram. So, yeah.
Zoom. That's well.
Yeah, or Zoom. All right, well, thank you, guys. And I appreciate you meeting and giving your time. And we will talk to you guys next week. Haribol.
Haribol.